Thank you, everyone. My name is Pellis. This is Karthik. And we're going to be talking about security response in the age of mass customized attacks. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you a little bit of an introduction to what mass customization means. And mass customization is actually a business term. So we're going to give you a little bit of a business background. But don't worry, this is a Hack in the Box talk. We are going to show details from the exploits we've been analyzing and give you the technical content that you sort of expect from Hack in the Box. The reason why we're sort of looking at this from a business perspective, though, is because everybody sort of looks at APT threats from a different angle, right? If you watch a soccer game and I'm behind one goal and Karthik's behind another goal, we'll have two completely different views of the game, even though we're watching the same event. And in the security industry, as we watch AP attacks in the wild and we watch 0 days propagate in the wild, the same sort of thing happens. Like the AV people have their view from where they're sitting, vendors have our view where we're sitting. And by taking a look at the concept of mass customization in business, you get a different view in terms of where exploits are going that you wouldn't normally get just through technical analysis. And we can use that to inform how we do some of our security response, because certain businesses evolve in certain ways regardless of the product they're selling. So we can expect the 0 day commercialization to follow those sort of same business trends. So please stick with us. There is definitely technical content. Actually, the majority of this presentation is technical content, but we're going to start by giving you a brief intro into what it means. For background, Karthik and I both work as part of Adobe's security incident response team. We refer to product security incident response team called PSIRT. So if you send a 0 day to Adobe, either he or I will be the first ones to analyze it. So we have spent a lot of time with these 0 days. We are the people that take a look at these attacks. If it's Flash Player, it's usually me. If it's Reader, it's usually Karthik. In some cases, we both jump in and work on it. For instance, in the Reader 0 day, we're sort of racing each other to see who can analyze it first, just out of personal competition. But basically, when people find stuff and they send it into PSIRT, it's going to follow sort of the process you would expect for most companies in terms of coming into us. We create a tracking number, we give it back to you. If you happen to have any research you want to share with us, please find us afterwards. We'd be more than happy to talk to you about it. And we also work with the larger team called Asset, which is the proactive team within Adobe that works with product teams to create fixes once we've done the analysis. We work with researchers to verify, publish bulletins. We're a partner in the Microsoft Active Protection Program for getting vulnerability information out to the AV and IDS vendors and the IDS vendors. So part of what we're doing, when we're doing this research and we're looking at these 0 days from February, is not only taking a look at how they're technically crafted, but also trying to figure out what we can learn from them in terms of that we could feed back into our secure development lifecycle processes to make our software better. So now I'm going to turn everything over to Karthik, and he's going to give you the background on mass customization.
Thank you, Pellis. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. So the first part of this talk is about some business concepts and the trends we're seeing in exploit creation we think are related to some of these business concepts. So let's begin with mass customization. What is mass customization? A little bit of history before we get started. It's actually a concept attributed to Stanley Davis, a business consultant and a former business professor at Harvard, Columbia, and Boston University. He first introduced this concept in a book in 1987. The title of that book is Future Perfect. So how did he define mass customization? Well, he defined it as the customization and personalization of products and services for an individual customer at a mass production price. Another way of saying that is effectively postponing the task of differentiating a product for a specific customer until the latest possible point in a supply network. Now, traditionally, customization and low costs have been mutually exclusive. Mass production was cheap, but it didn't go hand in hand with customization. And customization was the mainstay of product designers and craftsmen. So let's look at a classic example from the automobile industry to understand mass customization, mass production, and customization a little better. And this example comes from the Ford Model T. There are many of the same kind with little or no variation. And Henry Ford is famously said to have said about the Model T, you can have any color car you want as long as it's black. Now, in contrast to the massive numbers of replicas of the Model T, is a different kind of example. This is a custom replica of a Bugatti from an auto show. And what's different here is that there's not thousands or millions of copies, but rather just a handful. And this is an example of customization in contrast to mass production in the Model T. Now, another business consultant, Joseph Pine, discusses the spread of mass customization into other industries in his book entitled Mass Customization. ATMs are an example of how mass customization entered the financial industry. Now, with your ATM card, you could go to any bank, most places in the world, and experience customized service from your financial institution, which is only one of thousands. And how many people here have designed their own PCs? Let's see a show of hands. How many people have designed their own PCs? All right, about 20%. So that's an example of mass customization in the PC hardware industry as well. So you could design your own PC from a lot of different components from a lot of different suppliers. So as a business idea, mass customization can be found in automobiles, manufacturing, electronics, and the list really goes on. And the premise of this talk that Pellis and I are giving is that this trend, we can say, is now applying to exploit creation. And what we're seeing is that the beginning of mass malware becoming mass customized attacks. And in the rest of this talk, we're going to give you a little bit of evidence that shows that this trend is beginning. All right, so let's cover a little bit of ground. Most of you should be familiar with this already, but mass malware is an example of something that's mass produced. And like most of you know, some examples of exploit kits include Black Hole, Phoenix, MPAC, CrimePack, Eleanor. Of course, exploit kits support multiple browsers, multiple versions of browsers, and different versions of plugins, Java, Adobe Reader, Adobe Flash. And the neat thing about exploit kits is that they're very modular. You could add, if you're the bad guy who's making these exploit kits, you could create a new module and plug it in. It's plug and play for any module. And not only are the modules that induce a crash and divert code execution modular, but also the payloads. So whatever is delivered to a victim upon successful compromise is also modular. One of the idea of zero-day exploits being repurposed as modules comes from Dan Guido's Exploit Intelligence project, so that's a useful reference if anyone is interested. Okay, so exploit kits can be served from anywhere, and the malware that's served on successful compromise can also come from anywhere. They're relatively cheap, in the order of $1,000, and it's commonly agreed that criminal enterprises, organized groups, or gangs are behind these things. Just last week, there was a news story on ZDNet about the hackers behind the Carburp botnet who were arrested. So it's an organized group that's putting this out. It's a business. Moving right along. This paper by Kohlberg et al., A Taxonomy of Obfuscating Transformations, is a wonderful reference on obfuscation, and it provides a common terminology for discussing obfuscation. So these guys provide 3 characteristics concerning the quality of obfuscation transformations. And we'll discuss these in light of the obfuscations we see in mass malware and which we do not see in targeted attacks. So what are these characteristics? 1, potency. This refers to the degree to which an analyst who's deobfuscating an exploit is frustrated. 2nd, resilience. This refers to the resistance to automatic deobfuscation of exploits. And 3rd, cost. This is the overhead to the application. Now, this can be kind of a tricky concept to grok, but let's say an exploit covers multiple different versions of an application. In terms of this terminology, the cost of the application would be high. So you're going to hear me refer to a lot of these terminology in the coming slides, so it's good to keep these 3 terms in mind. Now, on another axis, in contrast to Kohlberg's terminology, we can just look at basic technical characteristics of an exploit. Does it support multiple operating systems, multiple kinds of payloads, multiple service packs? This is more commonly discussed in our industry. And how complex is the obfuscation, right? So I'm going to walk through the process of deobfuscating a piece of malware, CV 2010-0188, which, according to the Contagio malware dump, is found in all those different kinds of exploit kits. So it's a pretty good example, representative example of the characteristics in mass malware that are indicative of complexity and obfuscation. And it might actually surprise you to learn that despite this exploit being almost 3 years old, it's actually one of the most common exploits that we in Adobe PCert receive on a regular basis. So it's a representative example. All right. So if you read Kohlberg-Dahl's paper, he goes through some different kinds of terminology to describe and catalog correctly the types of obfuscation. Here you see some variable names being split. They're scattered all over the place. There's data obfuscation. There's a little bit of layout obfuscation because it's hard to read the code. So let's call this layer 1. All right. So if you spend a little bit of time within a JavaScript debugger, you can arrive at something like this. It's a little more readable, basically the same JavaScript rewritten. Some of the variables are renamed. The JavaScript is normalized. And the layout is a little more friendly to whoever's reading it. And from this representation, it's possible for us to induce, or deduce, some kind of functionality. Let's call this layer 2. So part of what the exploit is doing is clear, but not always. So we've got to continue the obfuscation. Let's call this layer 3. So we get to this layer, there's a form field name whose purpose isn't known. We've got to continue the obfuscation to get to the bottom of what this exploit is doing. And then when you continue down that path, you're led to other variables. It looks like a string of hexadecimal numbers. What does that do? Spend more time on it, get to layer 5. All right, so finally, you spend a bit of time on this, get through 5 layers of obfuscation, and it's sort of clear what is this exploit doing. So the heap is being sprayed with some shellcode, and then there's a variable NAZ, N-A-Z. What is that? So within the document object model of JavaScript within PDFs, it's possible for variables to reference other parts of the PDF. And if you were only analyzing this stream, there was no other reference to NAZ. So the NAZ was actually a variable that was from a different part, from a different stream in the DOM. And that's where a TIFF image, which was triggering a bug in Reader, was being loaded from. So the heap had been primed with shellcode, and then a different part of the PDF was invoked to load this TIFF image, which would crash Reader, and then control will flow into the shellcode. So it's a relatively complex exploit to reverse engineer, but it takes about 5 layers. So in Kohlberg et al.'s terminology, you would say that this is a highly potent and resilient exploit. All right, so we just looked at a technical walkthrough of CV2010-0188, but what does that tell us about mass production? Exploit kits, you could say, are specialized machines with various interchangeable parts. And the example we just saw, CV2010-0188, you could say that is an interchangeable part within any kind of exploit kit. It could be hosted anywhere and serve malware from anywhere. And it's low cost partly because the module for the exploit can be changed in and out. And again, the Exploit Intelligence Project is a good reference for that. So I'm going to contrast everything I told you about the features of mass malware by giving you an example of a targeted zero-day attack and talking about some of the features that are unique to that kind of attack. So back in December of 2011, we in Adobe PCert were sent a malicious PDF file by a partner. And the accompanying message was just something like, looks like a zero-day crashes Reader 946. So at the time, Reader 946 was the most current version of Reader. And when you're analyzing malicious PDFs, if something is affecting the most current version of your platform, that's what you're most concerned with. All right, so we took apart this exploit. There was some heap spray stuff going on, not very complex. You could say it's low potency. There was some variable renaming, so it wasn't immediately clear what the control flow was. However, with just a single line of Perl and string matching and replacing, you could easily get past that level of obfuscation. And so you could say there's just one layer of obfuscation, and it's low potency and low resilience. In fact, I would conjecture that this level of obfuscation was just enough to bypass heuristic checks in antivirus at the time. And there was no need to over-engineer this exploit to go past any other kind of AV. Well, what about version checking? One of the features in mass malware that we'll talk about, cost, is proportional to the number of versions that are supported by an application. Now, at first glance, it may seem like this targeted attack supports multiple versions. But in fact, that's not the case. One of the first people outside of Adobe, an independent researcher, to also take apart this exploit Brandon Dixon. He said something like most JavaScript observed in other malicious files, checks are done for the proper version number before main routines are executed. What is interesting about this document is that it checks for versions that do not exist and makes a point to redirect the user to an infinite loop, assuming they're running a version greater than 10. So to recap that, there wasn't too much complex obfuscation in the way the heap spraying was done. And then only a particular version of Reader was targeted, the latest version of Reader 9 at the time. In conclusion, this exploit contained features of a targeted zero-day attack. And the people who wrote this exploit perhaps did not need to support other versions of Reader because the organization they were going after was only running, say, Reader 9, and there was no economic need or otherwise to target Reader 10. So I'm going to hand it back to Pellis, and we're going to continue the discussion of features specific to targeted zero-day attacks.
Right. So thus far, we've been talking about Reader 0 days that we've seen in the wild. But the features that Karthik has described are limited to Reader. We see this in other malware that we analyze. For instance, this is from CV 2011-2110, and this was a Flash player 0 day that we dealt with in 2011. And it had a couple of interchangeable parts to it. The first was that the URL for the payload was passed in as an obfuscated string to the Swift, so they could repurpose the Swift over and over again with different payloads just by changing the variable that they passed into it. And they also did version checking to make sure that it worked with the most recent versions of Flash Player. So these techniques can be seen in a lot of different malware. If you look through it, it's fairly common for a lot of groups. So what's the differentiator for mass customization? Most of these things, the interchangeable parts, the obfuscation, those are all things that are evident in mass production. You can see those in malware. But what are the things that actually make this malware and these attacks classify as mass customization? And this table here is from Joseph Pine's book on mass customization. It talks about features in the competitive landscape in the 1990s that help drive mass customization. One of those was cycle time reduction. Another one was quick response. So one of the things that makes you go from mass production to mass customization is the need to be able to meet customer needs faster. Right? With mass production, you can provide stuff to a large number of people, but they all get the same box. Like if you go into a store, whatever's on the shelf is what you get. And that's different from a desktop PC market where you can sit there and every person can order their own version of their Dell PC or Gateway PC. You need to be able to provide people with a customized response at a much quicker rate. And in the security industry, one of the things that's been happening on the defensive side is the need to turn things over more quickly. This is a graph from that covers all Adobe products in terms of our response time to vulnerabilities that are reported to us. Back in 2008, our average across the company was around 55 days, and now we have that driven down to under 14 days for our zero-day response time. So the 0 days that occurred in February that we were dealing with, the 3 Flash Player 0 days, the Reader 0 day, all of those we were able to turn around in less than 14 days. And in addition to that, the ability for us to distribute patches to a large customer base has also increased. For instance, within Flash Player, we have a background updater now. And that background updater will check for updates every single day. So, yesterday we pushed out a patch that had the Pondone fix from CanSec West. And probably by the end of this week, when we're all flying home, probably about 3/4 of the people that run Flash Player will have that patch if they're running the background updater, right? So what we've done is for the people that create mass malware kits is those 0 days have a much shorter shelf life, right? Your 0 days, it's much harder for those 0 days to have an effect over a longer period of time because the vendors are responding quicker and we're also shipping updates to end users faster. So that's where you start to get to this mass customization idea, where you have the platform, you basically have these frameworks for delivering exploits to customers, and they have interchangeable charts. You can dynamically pass in payloads. You can choose which obfuscation technique you want to be able to use. You can have some of the shellcode sort of genericized for different versions. And that allows you to do mass production of those 0 days and get them out through your crimeware kits. But for the people that are marketing these 0 days, they need to be able to do mass customization. They need to be able to plug in 0-day exploits on a fairly rapid basis so that they can do the turnover they need such that customers can get exploits working at a much faster rate. Because as soon as I give it to one guy and that guy gets caught, the 0 day is burned. So now I gotta give it another I have to have a different 0 day to give to my other customer because the first one got burned. And I need to be able to turn that over fairly quickly. So if we take a look at CV 2013-0633, now we're starting to get into the 0 days that were in February. There was a lot of attacks going on in February. There were 3 different Flash player 0 days and a reader 0 day, all within a very short period of time. I'm not sure who was mad at who, but they were definitely shooting each other in a digital warfare game. This one was a Flash player vulnerability. It's one of the first ones we patched. And it was an attack against fonts. They found a font parsing bug in a font called Diablo. And they exploited that within Flash player. And they had some of the things that you would expect in a mass-produced Swift, where they have the version checking there. And they have the component, they have things broken down into components, which is another aspect of mass production. So if you look at the shell code here, and if you look at the action script code here, they've got their layout of the attack fairly well segmented. They have build ROP, they have build shell code, get memory at, write memory at. A lot of these functions get repurposed in a lot of Swifts. You'll see them from time to time. And the part that is specific to the 0 day is basically the load font, because that was what they needed for this particular instance of the 0 day. So you still have those interchangeable parts for mass production along with the 0 day attacks. Another one that we dealt with that came in at almost the exact same time was CV 2013-0634, and this was known as the Lady Boyle attack. And this one was really, really interesting in terms of its overall sophistication. It was definitely the work of people that knew what they were doing, taking the time to QE it on everything, and creating a truly vicious attack. So one of the things that it used is this is the exploit that used the vector heap spray methodology that Haifei Lei wrote a paper on. If you haven't seen his paper, I suggest you read it. But it was a fairly complex, relatively new method for doing heap sprays in Flash player. So that component was relatively new. I was able to tie it back to one Swift from 2012. So if you're in the AV group and you like to tie attacks together, the same technique was used in 2012-54. But that's the only one that I recall it being used in. And it was a new, sophisticated way of doing heap spray exploits. This was the first Flash player exploit in the 6.5 years I've been at Adobe, where there was a 0 day found in the wild that was actually targeting Macs. So it would target either Firefox or Safari on Mac. So they were able to test it there. If it was on Windows, it would be delivered via an Office document. Not necessarily something new there. This came out just before we released Click to Play for Office, for Flash player. Now if you have a recent version of Flash player and an Office document tries to instantiate it, we throw up a dialog saying, hey, we're in Office, chances are this wasn't what you meant to do, please click close, to try to block Office attacks as a means for delivering Flash player exploits. But this came out right before it, so there was a window version delivered via Office documents. The payloads on it were also fairly sophisticated. They had different payloads embedded in the Swift for both 32-bit and 64-bit operating systems. And the 32-bit version was actually digitally signed from a certificate issued by Thought originally to a Korean gaming company. It was actually out of date, but it was still digitally signed by something by Thought. So they bothered to sign the payloads. So as you can see from this attack, they actually spent a pretty decent amount of time coming up with something that worked wherever you sent it, whether it was Mac or Windows. They had digitally signed payloads to try to bypass some AV checks. They accounted for different architectures for 32 and 64-bit. This was somebody who spent a lot of time working this out and making it sophisticated. And when I say it supported Windows, I don't just mean XP, Vista, and Win 7. They actually made it work for Windows Server versions. So it supported Server 2003, Server 2003 R2, Server 2008, Server 2008 R2. Also, in terms of Flash Player support, it supported the last 6 versions of Flash Player. And this is interesting because right now we're shipping Flash Player updates once a month. That's our current goal is to, we're clearing out a whole bunch of bugs, so we're shipping things once a month scale. That's why you have 3 different versions of 11.4, 3 different versions of 11.5. So in order for somebody to write shellcode to be able to test against all those versions, you have to keep up to date, right? You have to make sure you keep copies. Every month you go download the latest Flash Player version, keep an update around. You have to have VMs set up to do the matrices of all these different combinations to test in this environment. So they have multiple VMs set up to make sure it's stable in any configuration that it's deployed in. And so if you're used to the idea, like if you've ever worked as a consultant, you've done consultants, you've worked for companies that don't write specs, and you've had to sort of look at code and infer what the spec was, right? And from looking at this, you can actually look at the list of supported versions and say, all right, somebody had a clear customer requirement from one of their customers that had to support all versions of Windows. Because otherwise, why would you support Flash Player on server? Like, why would you send an Office document to support a Windows Server version? There's not that many people opening malicious email attachments from Windows Server. But you know, if the customer requests all versions of Windows, you make sure it supports all versions of Windows. And so they tested all the Windows Server versions as well. So a very sophisticated attack that we saw, and we spent some time analyzing. The third Flash Player bug that we had to deal with in February, just 2 months ago, was Flash Player CV 2013 60. Oh, this is the reader 0 day. So one of the other bugs that we had to deal with was the reader 0 day, and it was sort of complicated in that it's not just one bug. So they had to escape the sandbox, and so they had more than one bug. That made it actually harder for us to test because we have to test both the original crash as well as the sandbox escape. One buffer overflow, they had one information leak, and they had the sandbox escape. So it was a total of 3 bugs that we had to go through and pull out the shellcode from that and test the patches for each one of those. So it took a little bit more time in terms of analysis, because now instead of dealing with one bug, you have to deal with 3 bugs at 3 different layers of execution. And the JavaScript was heavily obfuscated. And I'll let Karthik talk about this a little bit.
Sure, just some brief. So that's a screenshot of some of the JavaScript from that exploit, and definitely very complex, high potency, high resilience. There was some variable name rewriting, and as with some of the targeted zero-day attacks, it was possible to use some Perl scripting to get through that layer. However, it wasn't comprehensive, and there were still a lot of layers of reverse engineering and debugging to be done at that point. What was interesting was one of the variable names was Diavolo. If you paid attention to the other Flash 0 day, the font being loaded there was Diavolo. So at this point, Puss and I asked each other whether we should call the Exorcist or continue debugging. We continued debugging. And of course, this exploit used multiple reader extended features. And this was a record in terms of how many different kinds of versions of reader were supported. So in addition to the particular point product versions, there's also sub-versions for 3 different languages: Arabic, Greek, and Hebrew. And versions ranging from 9, which obviously doesn't have a sandbox, to 10, which does have a sandbox, to 11, which has a super sandbox, are all supported. And all those bugs that Pelish talked about, the information leak, the crash, and the sandbox bypass, were chained effectively for all 3, for all these versions of the exploit. So I'm going to turn it back to Pelish to talk about the 4th 0 day we had to contend with. And incidentally, these 0 days are being presented in the order in which we encountered them.
Right. So it was pretty impressive to have a reader sandbox escape, just sort of in general, because it was the first reader X 0 day we had seen in 2 years. Like when Karthik had talked earlier about the ones that we had seen the most of from 2010, it was because it was the first reader 0 day in the wild in over 2 years. So they spent some time actually crafting it. But right after that, we got the CV 2013-0648, and this was a Flash Player sandbox escape. So we have sandboxes for Flash Player in Chrome and Firefox, and we use protected mode in Internet Explorer. So this was a Flash sandbox escape targeting Firefox. And again, this bug was a little interesting in that we think we caught it in the wild. Well, not we, the person who reported it to us had caught it in the wild, sort of when it was still under development, because all the parts weren't quite there yet in terms of what was there. But there was enough there to verify that they did have a 0-day and that there was enough there for us to actually issue patches for it. The reason why I think it was still under development was because it targeted one single version of Flash Player. So I think it was the version of Flash Player that the guy had on his machine that he was doing the development with. And adding version support for other Flash versions probably would have come at the next stage. You know, get it working first in one version, then expand out. It only targeted Firefox because the sandboxes are different between the different browsers. So the sandbox we use in Firefox is different than the one we use in Chrome. It's different than what we use for protected mode. So if you're going to do a sandbox escape, you have to pick which browser you're going to go after because the techniques aren't as universal in the different browsers. But the action script for it supported MSIE, Chrome, Opera, and Firefox. So the actual initial shell code, that for getting control inside the sandbox, they were developing it out to be universal to work on all browsers. We only found the one that had the Firefox sandbox escape. So this was a bug that they were trying to get the original crash to work for all browsers, including Chrome, and then they're pasting it together with the sandbox escape, and they had the one that we found was the sandbox escape for Firefox. It was a fairly complicated setup in order to get it to work. This was not an attack you could deliver in an Office document because it required you to have a web page and it loaded 2 different Swifts as part of the attack and part of the heap spraying technique they used. So this one could only be deployed via the web because you needed to be able to have this setup. But it's sort of an indication that people are starting to do sandbox escapes. They're starting to deploy multiple bugs. That particular CVE, the way they got out of the sandbox wasn't by finding a bug in Flash Player. What they did is they loaded another product that's separate from Flash Player, and they had a vulnerability in that, and then they got out that way. So it was also a fairly interesting exploit in that they're starting to see multi-product attacks, where they're combining bugs from different products, different vendors, to be able to create the exploits that they need. It's not just like one self-contained bubble where it's completely all inside Flash Player, it's completely all inside Reader. They're starting to mix and match what they've got. And so in this next section, now that we've covered the different 0-days, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the digital evidence of commercialization that you can see. And in the beginning of the talk, I used the phrase APT. If you've been in the industry for a while, you know that APT is sort of this overused term with sort of a vague definition. If you're dealing with the media, it's the phrase you throw out to explain how you got attacked. If you're selling something, this is the magic threat that the security widget will protect you from. But one of the interesting quotes I have from someone that I was talking to that worked for a 3-letter agency was he basically considered an APT any attack that involves a program manager. Any attack where you've got a group of people, you've got a program manager driving it, they have goals, they have objectives, they have timelines, et cetera. And from those 4 0-days that we've looked at, you can see evidence of a product manager. If you look at the code and you try to infer back what the spec was by reading the code, you can see requirements like support all versions of Reader. The Reader 0-day that Karthik talked about supported 12 different versions, including subversions for different languages. Supporting all versions of Windows, even the server versions. It may not be practical to exploit somebody who's running Server 2003, but they say all versions of Windows, you support all versions of Windows. All current versions of Flash, supporting all browsers, Firefox, Chrome, IE, Opera, right? You can start to reflect out that there's definitely sort of written to spec sort of things. And the complication behind these exploits is is growing as well. Like the Slammer worm, I think was like 376 bytes total. It was only 376 bytes. The Reader 0-day, when Karthik and I were going through that, just the JavaScript portion, not the C code for the shell code and the assembly that went behind that, just the JavaScript and going through the JavaScript obfuscation. Depending on how you deal with carriage returns in JavaScript code, it was roughly 8,000 to 9,000 lines of just JavaScript code to set up the heap and get everything ready so that you could then do the shellcode layer of the attack and do the assembly layer of the attack. So someone spent some time developing that. I mean, it was because that JavaScript code isn't 8,000 lines of easy JavaScript code either, right? Because you're trying to do memory manipulation, getting things laid out, referencing things in the document model. This isn't just like they imported jQuery and that counted for like 10,000 lines. This is handwritten, obfuscated code that they put together. And when I look at these, one of the things I sometimes think about is, as the complexity of all this grows, as they start writing exploits to specs, like a lot of people are familiar with this cartoon about how software development happens, where this is what the customer needed, this is how the customer explained it, this was how the project was described, right? Like a lot of people have probably seen this graphic, and you begin to wonder if the exploit development becomes this complex, where they're working from specs and they're having to combine multiple products. Is this what's going to happen to Vupin and the companies that are actually doing this professionally? And are you going to end up with like 24/7 customer support hotlines for Vupin, where it's like, hello, welcome to Vupin technical support. If your 0 days being detected by antivirus, please press 1. If your 0 days working correctly, please press 2, right? As they go to this mass commercialization, like it's kind of curious to see how far it will actually go and whether you're going to start getting to exploits that sort of look like these. And also looking towards the future, as I said in the talk, if you understand the business drivers and you look at it from a business perspective, you can actually use that to try to come up with some conclusions about how you change how you do things technically, how do you change the response within your company, what's going to be coming down the road. Because all businesses sort of follow the same model regardless of the widget they're selling, whether it's an exploit or it's a chair or a car. They all go through the same evolution when it comes to business development. So when we look towards the future, what does that mean? What does all this mean other than being kind of interesting way of looking at things? I think one of the things that we're going to see is we're going to see more focused attacks. And we're starting to see this a little bit now, where in the past, Reader and Flash Player were targets of choice because the ubiquity of the software, right? Microsoft was very ubiquitous. Everyone went after Microsoft for a while. Once Microsoft got hard, they went after Flash Player and Reader because we had ubiquity. But if you have all this modularization and you have the ability to turn out zero-day code fairly quickly, and you can do this sort of speedy response, and you have all the parts and you can assemble stuff fairly quickly, going after smaller targets that don't have the same ubiquity in the market becomes much easier because it's just an interchangeable component at that point. So, for instance, there was a Flash Player 0 day that targeted Macs. In the past, there weren't very many 0 days that would target Macs because the ubiquity wasn't there. It wasn't very useful for the mass malware market. But now with 0 days, we're going to start to see attacks that can go after Macs, and they can take the time to do it because everything else is just an interchangeable part that they can plug and play into these types of attacks. And one of the disadvantages for vendors and one of the advantages for the mass malware market is that these interchangeable parts also make it much easier for the mass malware guys who are downstream that just sort of copy and paste whatever the zero-day manufacturers are doing. It'll be much easier for them to componentize it for their malware packs, your Eleanor, your Black Hole, et cetera. And we actually saw that with the Reader 0 day. Because it was the first Reader 0 day in 2 years, the mass malware market globbed onto it and it spread fairly quickly because now they finally had a PDF exploit they could use again. Everything else that they were using was like what Karthik described from 2010 and 2011. Now they had actually something new that they could go out and exploit. So the first generation of it was called Mini Duke, and then there was Ida Duke, which was like another phase of the attack, et cetera. So for the mass malware guys, as all these things become more componentized, it should become slightly easier for them.
Another point about copycat attacks is the pwn-to-own bug that was submitted by George Hotz used the February Reader 0 day as its template. So it was a different bug, but some of the techniques were copied right off the February 0 day.
Yeah, basically what he did is he took a Python script to substitute out the JavaScript from the Reader 0 day and copy his stuff in, because he didn't really know the PDF file format, so he just wrote a Python script to move the parts around. That was actually kind of a funny way to make it work. But you got it to work. Another thing you're going to see with all of this componentization is you're going to see more multi-vendor, multi-product attacks. As Apple and Microsoft and Adobe, as we all make things harder to attack, as we have become harder to attack, we're going to be raising the bar because Apple has sandboxing, application sandboxing now, Microsoft Windows 8 has sandboxing, Reader, Flash Player have sandboxing. So you're going to need more bugs to be able to achieve your attacks. And if you just look at many of the recent attacks that we've seen, and some of the attack research that we've seen, you're starting to get to this multi-vendor, multi-product attack area. So Pondo in 2013, the Chrome sandbox was bypassed by going out through the Windows kernel. The Flash Player exploit also had an IE10 aspect to it, where they went out through, Flash Player caused the crash, but then they had to get out of protecting mode, so they needed an IE bug to continue the attack. The Flash Player 0 day for the Firefox sandbox escape, that actually involved two different Adobe products. Flash Player caused the crash that got them the initial control within the sandbox, and then they had to load another Adobe product to escape the sandbox. And Peter Brungendehal, who gave a talk on PDF sandboxes at CanSec West, one of the attacks that he demoed was a multi-product attack. He found a crash from Reader and was able to get control that way, but then the way he got out of there is he had an IE 0 day, which he used to break out of the Reader sandbox by going out through IE. So you're going to start to see these more and more complicated attacks where it's not going to just be one product, it's not going to be just one vendor. And that's going to make things harder in terms of triaging these attacks. Just a couple of more examples. Ponium from 2012. Pinkie Pie got out of the Chrome sandbox using 6 different bugs. Glazunov got out using 14 different bugs to escape the sandbox. Right? So as a vendor, that's a lot of testing. You have to go and individually identify each one of those bugs. You have to be able to then create unit tests that target each one of those bugs. And creating unit tests isn't always easy because some of those APIs you can only reach once you have binary level control inside the sandbox. So then you have to write custom code to be able to hit all those layers and test those bugs. It means we have to pay greater attention to the shellcode that we take a look at. For instance, one of the things I was thinking about from the Pondone exploit from Bupin is I started to ask myself, would I have caught the IE aspect of that 0 day? Right? Someone would have sent it to me because they would have seen the Flash Player crash. I would have identified the Flash Player crash. I would have identified the Flash Player heap spray. But you know, I'd have to sit there and actually go through the assembly of the exploit to actually see the IE 0 day in there and be able to know that I have to go notify Microsoft because there's an IE component. Because I'm not equipped to test Internet Explorer. You know, so it means that we have to continue to take deeper and deeper looks to absolutely understand every aspect of an exploit because there are going to be these more subtle bugs. The first bug is always easy to see. But the layered bugs, like the information leak in the Reader 0 day, those are things that you can only see if you sit there and really spend some time with the shellcode and understand what's going on at each phase of the attack. And
a related point to that is that you know, we as vendors who work with bugs that involve multiple products, we might get false positive reports. So someone who submits a bug, they think it's in Flash Player, but in fact it's in another partner's product, and we have to do the due diligence and take it apart. But in the end, it's really something involving another vendor, and we have to hand that over responsibly.
Right, and we've had that case that happened to us in the past, where they may use Flash Player for the heap spray because they know Flash Player and how to do heap sprays in Flash Player, but it was actually a browser bug, and then we had to go and toss it over to the browser vendors because we were just part of being used for the heap spray. So, so we're going to have all these partnerships to be able to talk to all these different teams. And also, I made the point earlier about being able to target things for products that don't have as much popularity, that don't have the penetration. So with Bupin's bug, it's like, okay, if it's Microsoft, we have a good relationship with Microsoft. I know a dozen different people I can call if it's a bug in Microsoft. But if attackers get better and better at targeting specific individuals and knowing the individual's specific machine information before they send the exploit, yeah, that vendor software may be very it may be a vendor that we've never heard of before, and then we're going to have to go reach out to them as part of the zero-day response process. And then that adds steps to the zero-day response process. So we have to be able to plan for that. We have to be diligent in what we do. The complexity may lead to some benefits for vendors and people on the defensive research side. It will remain to be seen whether these actually help or not. For instance, when you have these bugs, which are, these attacks which are 14 bugs long, you don't necessarily have to address all 14 in your immediate response, right? You want to get a patch out there that will kill the bug that's out there now, but you may have a little bit of time for addressing the rest of them. And so like Google did this with the Ponium research, where the bug that they turned around in 24 hours to hit their 24-hour mark on Ponium, they addressed a couple of the bugs, and then some of the other more subtle bugs they addressed over time. So vendors may have the capability of picking which bugs that they're going to choose to strategically cut off the exploit until we can get to all of them. Whether this is any help to AV or IDS vendors will remain to be seen. As everything gets componentized, that's going to multiply the number of signatures that you have to have, because you have to have signatures for all the different parts. But on the plus side, you might be able to be smart about what you create signatures on. You might be able to create signatures on essentially the frame that everything is bolted onto, as opposed to the things that are being bolted onto. So that might be something that helps AV IDS vendors. Sort of remains to be seen as a possible benefit. And then the one hope that I have is as they create more complex software, they will start having the same bugs that we do when we create complex software. It's sort of a small hope of mine, but we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, we can always hope that the bad guys push the button a little too quickly and there's no actual exploitation going on. We get the bug and we fix it before there's an actual exploit in the wild. Thanks, Bells. So what can we look to the future for, and what hope is there for defenders and academics? There's actually a tradition of research into normalization of malicious executables to make malware more easily detectable by antivirus programs. So I'm going to talk about 3 different research groups and some of the stuff they've done, and I think there's something we can learn from these people. So Christo Deresquit al's normalizer handles 3 kinds of code obfuscations: code reordering, packing, and junk insertion. This other group, Lakodia and Mohammed, introduce a zeroing transformation of malcode into normal form. Another group, Brishi et al., perform algebraic simplification and dead code elimination. Now, you could look at this and go, like, how does this apply to the rest of this talk and what we've been saying? It's that the research and the direction that these people have advanced can be applied to lessons in deobfuscating JavaScript and normalizing JavaScript and compiled ActionScript. And these are open research topics for defenders and academics. So in conclusion, we've summarized and used several case studies to point to a trend that mass malware features are being combined with multiple zero-day exploits. And we're starting to label that trend mass customized attacks. Now, this is a page out of a business textbook. And the reason that zero-day attacks are becoming mass customized attacks are manifold, but they're comparable to the reasons for the evolution of mass customization in other industries, as listed in this table from Joseph Fine's book, Mass Customization. Now, defenders in other software companies could look at this and go, how do I explain the challenges in my day-to-day job with MBA types, and then use some of the terminology here. So let's walk through a few of these and how that argument could be made to people up the management chain. So if you look at cycle time reduction, quick response, and shortening product life cycles, Pellis talked at length on this topic, but what it comes down to is that Adobe's patching and quick response is putting pressures on the exploit writers to do things a little different. Continual improvement. Pellis talked about a zero-day in Flash Player, which was originally targeting Macs, but later was repurposed for Windows. That's an example of continual improvement. There might have been a customer who was only running Windows and not Mac, and so the people who wrote the exploit repurposed it for Windows. Regional marketing globalization. For several of the exploits we discussed, there's customized shellcode and operating system versions supported, including language path differentiation. And that's an example of globalization and regional marketing. Just-in-time production. We noticed that in exploit kits, you can swap modules in and out. Some of the same things are being seen with exploits these days, with multiple exploits being bundled into one attack. So in conclusion, we're seeing that the features of mass malware, when combined with targeted zero-day attacks, And the bundling of multiple zero-day attacks into a single attack are the next coming trend of mass customization and exploits. And what can we do as defenders? Phyllis is going to talk a little bit about that.
Right. So, so when we talk about mass customization, one of the concepts is, flexible manufacturing systems and product modularization. And so what we have to do is a little bit of mass customization on our side to be able to match the innovation that they're doing on their side. And there's going to be some challenges that we're going to have to deal with in terms of meeting that goal. For instance, when you're dealing with these multi-bug attacks, your response time is going to be somewhat slowed because you have to be able to go and test all those bugs, find them all, research them all. It's not going to be as quick as, oh, you go find the crash, it's a string copy, change it from a string copy to a string end copy or some other function and ship it out the door. We're going to be spending more time taking a look and taking apart these 0 days before we turn around the response. So we need to be able to make sure that our response is going to be proportional to the complexity that we're seeing. We're going to have to look through all the shell code, make sure that we reverse all the shell code and read it through. So if we have a Flash player 0 day that also has an IE 0 day, that we are able to notify Microsoft in time so that they can get a head start on their portion of the response. And we have to be prepared for those types of situations. Like you have to have a game plan in place so that you know how to be able to contact those other vendors, have those relationships built up. It'll be easy if it's one of the top companies because we have relationships with Apple and with Microsoft and Google. But it may be harder if they start to become very targeted, if they start to hit very specific software, because then we have to be able to go out and find those teams, find their response teams, et cetera. So it'll be interesting to see how this changes going forward. In terms of cycle time reduction, sharing products, we have to be able to be on our toes at all times to be able to have the quick response, right? We have to be scaled up enough that if we get a 0 day that has 3 bugs, we have enough team members in place to be able to go through and find all those bugs, test all those bugs in roughly the same amount of time that we do for a traditional 0 day or like a 2008 0 day where we had to turn it around. So we have to be scaled to deal with that. And part of what we're doing is an increased rate of updates. So for instance, with the Flash player, we're pushing once a month now so we can proactively get patches out fairly quickly. But that also gives us the ability to have trains which are going out the door every month. So when we do get a 0 day, there's a train that's likely going to be coming soon that we can toss that patch into and get it out the door to customers to be able to protect them. And this is really going to push vendors towards defense in depth for things that are meta bugs. For instance, heap sprays. Heap sprays aren't technically a bug in and of themselves. It's just sort of a byproduct of working with virtual machines. There was a paper recently on how to do heap sprays in HTML5. Basically, you can do these in almost any virtual machine, and there's defense in depth that you can put in place. But as we move towards these multi-bug attacks, APIs that we thought used to be safe because they were buried, behind data validation, which happens up front, those will become more exposed. People are going to start prodding those API, those internal APIs, which they may not have gone after before. So we have to take a look at sort of meta patches, like how do we harden our virtual machines against things such as heap sprays, and we also have to spend time looking at those defense in depth features, because as soon as they get those initial crash and they get control inside the sandbox, then they're going to be going after all those internal APIs or things that we thought typically wouldn't be targetable in a traditional attack, but now that they're doing multi-bug and they're combining stuff, we're going to have to spend a little bit more time doing that. And we also have to have robust patching testing in place so that we can test all those things, so that we can test bugs that are for APIs that are buried inside the application and that aren't directly exposed. Be able to call the sandbox APIs directly, to be able to call some of the internal APIs directly. Because they are getting better and better at what they do. For instance, I included this Twitter capture from Aaron Portnoy. He works for Exodus Intel. He's a good guy. He's not the guy who's typically dropping 0 days on us or anything like that. He's actually a pretty good guy who responsibly discloses stuff to us. We work with this company. He's got a good company. But one of the things that he does is he helps weaponize exploits as part of what he does within his company. And you can see that he has the capability of not only bypassing deafening SLR, but he also has techniques for going after EMET protected machines. So even if you have EMET installed, he's working on techniques to be able to bypass EMET. So it's a continual race to be able to keep up with what their capabilities and to be continually adding these layers of defense and depth to be able to protect in these environments. And that's why you see some of the operating system vendors like Apple and Microsoft putting sandboxing into the desktop application space, is because it's a cooperation between all of us to be able to have this many layers of defense, to be able to deal with this sort of increasing rate that comes from mass customization, the quick response, and the quick turnaround. So with that, we'll go ahead and take any questions you guys have. If you want to be able to reach out to us, this is our contact information. You can send us emails with questions from the talk. You may also see us floating around our booth. We have a booth over in the vendor area where we'll also be able to take questions. But any questions now that people have?
Questions from the floor? Here.
Sure.
I was just wondering how much effort's being put into fixing the bugs before they're exploited as opposed to patching them after they've been exploited.
So we do have a security software development lifecycle where we're constantly looking for vulnerabilities, and we're testing through internal fuzzing efforts, proactive stuff, using static analysis tools, all those things that you would expect. We also work with our partners. For instance, FlashPlayer is distributed through groups like Google. So if you look at the monthly updates, not only are we looking at our software to find the vulnerabilities, but we also have Google taking a look. They're reporting vulnerabilities to us. Many of the other partners that we work with, RIM's reported vulnerabilities to us in the past. So one of the advantages that FlashPlayer has right now is that because we work with so many partners, it's not just our security response team that's looking for vulnerabilities, but also others. And if you saw some of the quotes from Vupin, from Pondone, we did get at least a little justification that we're making things harder, because the quotes, and he was quoted as saying, FlashPlayer is getting much harder for us to exploit. So I think it's a continual process. We're always working to find and solve vulnerabilities, but the work that we've been doing has actually been paying off. And the other thing that we're doing, in addition to just going after crashes just going after crashes is just sort of a race, and it's a very hard race to win. So the layer, the defense and depth features that we put in place have helped. So for instance, with Reader, like I said, the Reader 0 day that we had was the first one in 2 years since we deployed the sandbox. So we're able to spread the exploits out. And with FlashPlayer, we've done a number of things, such as I mentioned, we have click to play in Office now. So even if you have a crash, if you're going to try to send it out through a malicious Word document, we've added a layer of defense there that the user has to now click through this extra dialog, which says, and the dialog is phrased such that it basically says, FlashPlayer typically doesn't run in Word. You probably don't want to run this. By default, it says click no. So then if you have a crash, like we've taken steps to make that the delivery of those exploits much harder. There's someone back there.
We have time for one last question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi. I like the way that Adobe has stepped up with the sandboxing and the rapid response, especially with the protected view in Reader 11. But one thing that annoys me is that users want to do two things with PDFs. They want to read them, they want to print them.
Okay.
Printing, you have to disable the protected view. Is it ever going to be possible to do that from within the protected view?
Okay, so you're referring to the fact that there's a prompt there for when you want to go print. Right. Right, so the prompting on printing there is device drivers tend to be a favorite way of attacking environments. So in order to be able to print, you've got to be able to go through that. So we have the click there just to make sure that when you open up a malicious PDF, you don't go attack a printer driver. So I understand it's a step that's annoying, and we're always sort of refining what we do around that. But there is a reason that we have that click there.
Right, but so printing is always going to be unsafe. That's what you're saying. Reading is okay from within the protected view, but if you want to print, you open yourself up to more vulnerabilities.
Yeah, in some cases you may. So we just have that step there so that you have a chance to look at the PDF and make sure it's a PDF you recognize before you go to that next step, right? Because if you open it up in this PDF and it's, garbage, which a lot of exploits are, then you're not going to immediately hit print.
Yeah, with APTs, the view will be looking something that's interesting to you. So,
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
So we're still working on that. I mean, we updated the reader. I mean, we're continually working on the Reader Sandbox. With Reader 11, we added new protections where we run it on a separate desktop and a separate workstation. And we're going to continue to refine it going forward. I don't know when we'll be able to address that, but we'll continue to refine it going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pilius. Karthik, please join me in thanking them for their session today.